And yes, we're live. Hello, everyone. My name is Simon Gibson. Welcome to this, I think it's the 5th episode of Rhetoric Remix. Rhetoric Remix is an ongoing set of talks from professors, practitioners, experts from around the world who contribute their ideas on some aspect of rhetoric and public speaking. And so far, we've had contributions from experts in China, Poland, Russia, the USA, Denmark, Saudi Arabia, the UK, Finland. We've already had a tremendous range of different speakers and also, therefore, different sort of slices on rhetoric. And the aim of all of this is that over time, we build up a really top-notch resource from leading thinkers on rhetoric and public speaking, and that becomes a resource that is freely available to anyone. And this broadcast is going out on Facebook and YouTube, and then it remains as a resource there for anyone to join in and to learn from, we hope, a bit at least, or at least to enjoy. Today's broadcast is with Rhetoric Nielsen. Rhetoric Nielsen is one of today's leading speechwriters. So it's a really great pleasure and honor to have him contribute with us today. Rhetoric is a 2-time winner of the very prestigious Cicero Award for speechwriting. He's based in Denmark, but his career has been very global, and I'm sure his outlook and his comment very worldwide. He has, I think, an abiding passion in all things sustainable. And he directs much of his time towards that as well. Maybe we'll get some comment on that as well. But I think his main topic for today is going to be speech writing and storytelling, and perhaps also taking a look at the ways in which speech writing can evolve. So it's a great pleasure to have Rhetoric with us, and I'm going to hand over to him, and then we may come back for some questions later. Thanks very much, Rhetoric.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm happy to be here. What a impressive introduction to get. Thank you for that. Yes, my name is Rune Nielsen, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about how I think we as speechwriters and speech makers and public speaking pros are selling ourselves short. And it seems to me that speech writing can do so much more. Speeches can do so much more than what we're doing with it right now. And let me provide an example. How many times have you, as a speechwriter or a speaker, asked your audience maybe a month after the speech, what did you like? What do you remember? I assume you didn't. Most of us never did. Most of us never actually returned to our audience to ask them, what did you get from the words I spoke? Therefore, most of us simply stop at the applause. They applauded. They were glad. They were satisfied. I'm happy with the speech. And that's too bad, because we need so much more. There was a quote, I think it was attributed to John F. Kennedy, who said, the only reason to give a speech is to change the world. And I think the world needs changing acutely right now. We are in the middle of COVID-19. We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction event of biodiversity. We are in the middle of a climate crisis, moving fast towards a climate catastrophe. We need change right now, and I think speeches, speechwriters, speech makers, and public speaking pros are the ones who should really spearhead this. And I know that isn't easy, and I know most of us has been trained in the old antique Aristotelian rhetoric about logos, pathos, ethos, all these things. But the thing is to remember that speeches for Aristotle was in order to influence legal affairs, in order to influence political decisions. They were in order to celebrate people. And that's all short-term things. That's not long-term. And we need to influence long-term as well. We need to give people hope in terms of what their outlook on life should be and how their actions should evolve in terms of that. Now, in rhetoric right now, I see a lot of people grasping for this. I read about the ethnographic turn in rhetoric, where people are actually trying to analyze what's happening in this reception of our words in the audience. And I think that's extremely interesting and something that we should, by all means, grasp and fine-tune, because that will be the future of speech writing and speeches in general. It will be influenced by what the audience has to say, what they experience. Now, that's still in the going, but I think it's very important to take a look at some of the speeches that we all really revere, like Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. Now, Gary Young recently wrote a book called The Dream Speech, no, The Speech, about Martin Luther King's dream. And it was very eye-opening to me, at least, because he demonstrated how this giant of rhetoric gave the speech that we all know. We can all recite it almost word by word, but at the time, he was criticized for it. He was mocked. He was ridiculed. People were saying it was too radical. People were saying that it was polarizing, divisive. It was aggressive. And then 50 years later, it was deemed one of the best speeches ever made because it had a long-term impact. People had to mature to understand it and really get the grasp of it. One of the things that I also think is very interesting in terms of Gary Young's analysis of Martin Luther King's speech was that it was really two speeches. There was the promissory note part, and there was the "I Have a Dream" part. The promissory note was taken to be aggressive, divisive, confrontational. The "I Have a Dream" part was taken to be much more soothing, abstract, visionary speech. We remember the last part. We do not remember the first part. And that's too bad. So in terms of that, we really need to make sure that the right message is what's remembered in the end. I dare to say that had Martin Luther King been alive today, I think he would have wanted the promissory note to be what was remembered, not the "I Have a Dream." Another example of thinking more in the long term is Winston Churchill's speeches leading up to World War II. The "We'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them on the landing ground" speeches. They were very much received with negativity at the time, especially by people at the front. Richard Toy recently wrote a book called The Roar of the Lion, where he demonstrates through diaries that Winston Churchill's speeches were mocked. People were saying, what's he thinking about at the time? Today, he is deemed one of the best speech givers in history. And we are all fascinated by him and learning from his techniques. So we really need to make sure that we know what are we aiming at when we give a speech, when we write it and when we speak it. And I think my eyes was first opened to the immense impact we can have in, I think it was 2006. I'm not in rhetoric by training. I'm an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist. by training, and I was doing field work in Brazil. One day I'm walking around interviewing these activists of the Brazilian Black movement, which is a civil rights movement in Brazil, very much like the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in the United States. And what I hear are these stories. And I hear them again, and I hear them again. This activist tells me his story, this one. And they're all alike. And I start seeing these similarities in these stories. And it's not until a lot later that I start comparing where did they get them from, this storytelling structure that they get. And it points back to certain events, certain marches, protest marches, certain cultural events. And that's where people are telling their stories. They're creating, in anthropology, we call it a demonic story, or what's it called? A dominant and demonic. So we have these demonic stories that people are telling, and all of a sudden, in this community of people, a certain story becomes dominant. And once it's dominant, it's socially acceptable. And you start actually shaping your own story to that story, because that's a way of being accepted. And when we do that, speech writing and public speaking is an important, so important in that process of creating stories that we can all relate to and that are socially acceptable. One of the key characteristics of a speech is that it's given to a live audience that's socially together. They watch each other, and we all know with behavioral economics and stuff like that, that when that means social proof. When you're listening to a speech in an audience, you know the others are listening too. And you are assuming that they're influenced like you are. So really what's happening is that you're creating a social acceptable story by telling it to a large audience. And they can take that story and they can use it to shape their own stories. And all of a sudden you create a movement that has tremendous possibilities, tremendous potential. What I saw in Brazil was that Brazil has a long history of slavery. And for a lot of these people with dark skin that I was talking to, they were very much influenced by the fact that their ancestors were brought to Brazil as slaves from Africa. So they had a story that said Africa is an inferior continent of disease, civil war, and hunger. You guys were brought here. You worked on plantations. You were slaves ordered around by slave owners. At some point in history, white people gave you freedom. Value it. If you don't live up to the liberal ideas of freedom and making the most of it, that's your individual fault. That's the story they had lived all their lives, and it was frustrating and really debilitating for a lot of people. But the story they heard from these speeches, and the story that resonated through all the people that I talked to, was a different story. A story of Africa, of music, magic, warriors. A story of, sure, they were put on slave ships and brought to Brazil, but then they escaped. They created maroon societies around the Amazon jungle. They created an entire republic for 200 years in northeastern Brazil, fighting off Portuguese colonial powers. They fought revolution after revolution, revolt after revolt, to get their freedom, and at last it was given to them. They succeeded in claiming their freedom. They were resistance fighters, maroon warriors. They were quilombolas, as they said in Brazil. And that's the potential we have with speeches. We can give people that hope. We can move them from being descendants of slaves to being Quilombola warriors, resistance warriors, creating their own world, giving them agency of that world. And that's world changing right there. So that's one of the things that I think we should acknowledge as speech makers and public speaking pros, that anything less than changing people's stories for the better and thereby changing the world is selling ourselves short. And I think we need to talk about that as a community in a world that's in need of changing for the better.
Well, Ricky, that's kind of a fascinating point to kind of maybe come in on, in that I was thinking about President Kennedy's speechwriter. I think his name was Sorensen.
Ted Sorensen, yeah.
He was probably Danish.
He had Danish roots, yeah.
Yeah, good. But I remember him talking at one point about speech writing being a sort of visual roadmap, that you give people a vision of the way that you want the world to be, and you put that vision out, and that you hope people will follow it. And one can think of, for example, the go to the moon speech, which is really a vision. We choose to go to the moon. It wasn't anything other than just saying that's what we're going to do, and they did it. So there is this enormous power in speeches to provide a vision, and I just wonder whether that's what you were getting at when in the storytelling thing, that it's about sharing your vision of the world with other people. Is that where speeches work, do you think? Because I'm fascinated by that notion of where they work.
I think speeches work well with communicating a vision. Sure, that's very important, very, very good thing, but it's not enough. Had President Kennedy said that we choose to go to the moon without saying that we can do that, it wouldn't have worked as well. Now, the United States has a very powerful mythology of being pioneers, of moving towards the West, always moving the West, explorers. And that's why his vision worked in the United States, because they have that story about who they are. So, yeah. So I remember a section in the West Wing, the TV episodes with Sam Seaborn, a speechwriter, where he said, why do we want to go to Mars? Because it's next. And I think that's really the important, because next means there's something before. And that's the story of being pioneers and moving towards the West. If a prime minister in Denmark said, we need to go to the moon because we can, people would say, what? And it would not at all have the same pioneers moving the frontier. And so you need to not only put up the vision, you also need to create the story of who you are that enables you to realize that vision. I remember a speech by Malala Yousafzai. She gave it at the UN, where she was painting up this unique vision of saying, we want all girls to get an education. That's a very powerful vision. Of course, all girls should get an education. It will create a better world and everything. It's a very powerful thing. But then she did a small stroke of genius when she said later that everybody is fighting for that, whether you are a teacher or a student or a lover of books or anything. So all of a sudden she was saying, you're already in this fight. You don't need to change to fight with us. You are already fighting. You just need to step up a little.
Right.
And that's a very powerful thing. And I remember really taking that in. That's a good thing, to make sure that you have the story along with it, that people are already seeing this as the next. It's next in their development or in the storyline. And that's very different from, for instance, say Greta Thunberg right now on climate change, who's saying we're not doing enough. The house is burning and you're talking about other stuff. Why are you not doing anything? She is creating an acute need of action, sure. But she's also saying it's going to be hard for you to do it. So that's a very important thing that you make. If you want to create a much better future, for instance, a sustainable future, then you need to make sure that it's next in a process that's already there. In Brazil, when they were talking about equality and citizenships and no more racism and discrimination, that's because that's what was next. They had fought off slavery. They had fought the colonizers. They had fought the slave owners. They had revolted against being second-class citizens. What's next was equality. That's their Mars, their moonshot. If we want sustainability to be what's next, we need to create a past about it as well, and a present about it as well. So to say, John F. Kennedy, just to return to your question, John F. Kennedy could make the moonshot vision big because he had the story with him. He was building on an established story. A lot of us has to do something differently. We need to make sure to address the past. Otherwise, a lot of people will be hesitant and say, I don't think we can do it. They'll be demoralized. It's too big. It's too much. A sustainable future, what will it do? Why not just give up? But if you make sure you demonstrate in their past, in their story, that it's what's next, you've been doing it all along, then you are so much further. I have another friend who, like me, is called Rune. He has a channel called Nordic Animism. And what he's doing is immensely inspiring, because he's really showing that for 90% of humanity's existence, we were animists. We believed that nature, animals, plants had rights. They were people.
Yeah.
And if we go back to that, we are already on a path where we can say a sustainable future. That's what's next. But right now, with industrialization and capitalism and money being the name of the game, it's a far-fetched to say sustainability is what's next.
Yeah. I'm interested in this notion of the past in speeches. Many years ago, I went to a script writing course for sort of aspiring Hollywood writers, which I probably thought I was at the time, but sadly didn't turn out quite that way. And Robert McKee was he'd written I think The Sundance Kid, and some very great scripts, or at least contributed to them. And his overriding guide to making a great script for a film was backstory. And even if you didn't have the backstory obvious in the film, you had to know it and feel it, and the kind of film had to reflect a backstory. And is that what you're getting at in the storytelling thing, about somehow involving in a great speech the sense of a backstory, a tradition, a past, a thought that's already there that you build on? I just, if you could just elaborate on that a bit, because I think it's very interesting as to how you write a really great speech.
I think it's incredibly important to address the backstory, and it's really about what part of the past are you highlighting? What's really what you're pulling forth in terms of creating this plot line that will lead to the actions you want to make. In business rhetoric, when leaders are saying, okay, so we are in crisis, the company is in crisis, we really have to pull together to make this work, otherwise the company will be bankrupt in half a year. a good leader will make sure to point to the positive and inspirational, motivational future. This is going to be good. It's going to be better than it was. But the really great leader is going to say, you already did this. You have already pulled yourself together. I know you can do this because I've seen it. I've seen you do it. We can do it again. Let's do it again now. And then we can come to this future. And I think that's very important, because otherwise it's just, how are we going to do it? What values are we going to pull? How are we going to grapple with this? But if you make sure that backstory might be a good word for it. I'm not a screenwriter, but making sure that you have the past, the present, and the future with you all along. The past needs to demonstrate that you can do this. You've already done it. You just need to scale up. You are already on the path. The present needs to be that it's going to be hard. You're going to have to really pull yourself together. It's not going to be fun all the time, but we can do it. We're going to be here together, community. And the future is going to be this positive vision. In terms of the moonshot, we can do this. It's going to have all these effects, and we're going to be a much better place. And you really need all three. If you lack the past, people are not going to think they can do it. If you lack the present, you're not equipping them to really address it sufficiently. And if you're not addressing the future in a positive way, they won't know why they should do it, and they're going to be demotivated. So I think it's really about having the past, the present, and the future all along in the story. And as I said with John F. Kennedy, you don't need to do it explicitly if you're building on a story that you know everybody has and understands and are living. But in a globalized world, that's a hard thing to do. Not everybody is living the same story. And we are all really living a lot of stories at the same time, intermingling and interwoven. And one of the things that a good leader, a good speech does is really focus on one string of that carpet of stories, and making sure that you see the red thread going all the way through it, and where it leads, and what you need to do to get there.
Yeah, fascinating, because you mentioned the great Churchill speeches of the war, and one of the aspects, of course, which it's right there in their finest hour. He always managed to link what he was asking of people with a great tradition. Though we live for 1,000 years, this will still be their finest. So that's very interesting that he always linked it to what people thought they could already do.
Yeah.
And it takes me to I think an area that I've always been fascinated, and I just wonder what your thoughts are, is that the actual use of reference to time in speeches. In the Martin Luther King speech, he opens with a reference to a specific time, 70 years and 10. In the great Gettysburg speech, he refers back and forward, but he makes specific reference to time. And I've noticed again and again that good speeches seem to have this thread, to use your word, of being able to put time into a speech to somehow, and that seems to give it. I just wondered if you'd come across that, and what your thoughts were of how you can kind of create a greater dimension to a speech than just the words that you give.
Yeah. For me, it all comes back to building an audience.
Right.
When people gather to listen to a speech, they are not an audience initially, but the speaker make them an audience, because you really, through your words, you create a community of that audience, and if you're good, of a greater population. And a lot of these speeches that we talk about are political speeches made in a national environment.
Yes.
The Gettysburg Address in terms of the United States, Churchill in terms of the UK. and they are building on that, story, and I think it's very fascinating to build a community by building a past, or really framing a past, because the past is already there and you can't lie. People won't believe that. They know enough about their own history. But you can choose which events, which tradition, which values to highlight.
Yes.
And that's always the thing to do, in my opinion. And when working with this past, present, future frame, of course, it makes it more easy to work with when you're actually putting time slots into it. Also, people know when, for instance, in Danish context, in Denmark, we're very proud of our Viking seafarer pirate heritage. So addressing that is something that comes indirectly, but is very strong. We were an empire. We were seafarers and adventurers. And people will automatically go back to, yes, we were. That's just another way of framing it. And that's been used a lot. We were the pioneers of the seas at that time. And that has been used, for instance, in the green transition. Now we are the pioneers of windmills and green energy in that respect. So in that way, you can frame it by putting time slots into the past, present, and future. I think another aspect of it is really the change, because you can build this future and most people will likely be able to follow. But if you want a radically different future than what they're used to, you need to provide in lack of better word, a conversion story. You need not only to demonstrate that you are in this story, I want you in this story. You also need to create a story about changing. And that's where it gets tricky. I remember my in-laws have a lot of psychological training and books in the library, and I read about this narrative psychologist called Michael White, who was in the business of changing people's narratives for psychological purposes, from being victims to being survivors, really. And he did this by really working a lot with them in terms of framing that story and making it socially acceptable in these therapy groups. And that's, again, coming back to what you can do with an audience, that you can really change people that way, because all of a sudden, you know that these 1,000 people around you have listened to the same story. They have nodded their heads. and all of a sudden, it's a story. It's there. It exists. And you can relate to it. You can use it. So that's a very powerful thing. Of course, a lot of us, once we've left the audience, what do you do then? When you're no longer in that community that accepted that story, and you're in a new community that might not accept it. So that's another thing about thinking long-term in terms of transformation, that if you want the transformation to last longer than the speech, then you also have to make sure to provide arguments that will do that afterwards in a more not accepting sociality.
You talked about a story of conversion. I just wanted to briefly ask you about speeches about the environment and sustainability, which I'm is kind of one of your great passions, I know. I was asked by a student a few weeks ago. He said to me, "Why haven't there been any great speeches on the environment?" So I was to blame. But I wonder, and I thought actually perhaps there haven't been great environmental speeches. Greta Thunberg is a great force when talking about the environment, and she makes great forceful speeches. But her apart, Am I wrong that there have not been any great environmental speeches? And if so, why isn't that happening?
Well, I think there has been. I don't know what criteria we put up for great, but there has been very good speeches about the environment. Al Gore's speech was made into a movie at one point. And I know that Vital Speeches International publishes speeches. Cicero Awards have a sustainability category. There are good speeches being done on the environment and climate change as well. A lot of it falls on polarization. From my experience working with government officials and ministers in the green sector, environment, climate, energy, that sort, is that they are very focused on climate being expensive. Climate change, climate action is expensive. So we have to address the money all the time. Where do you get the money from? And that's really been an immense drawback from talking visions and painting a picture that really stands out in terms of great speech writing. There's always this underlying thing: is it really necessary? Is climate change always? Is it just fake news? Is it all these criticisms slowly undermining really the messaging? Because you always have to address that. And I think a lot of speeches on the environment and climate has really been addressed to the skeptics instead of talking to the people who really needs motivation. I think Greta Thunberg is a good example. She's rightly so yelling at the elite, the business and political elite. They need some yelling at. No doubt about that. But she's not motivating her own audience, her own community, in any other way than very indirectly. So we need some rabble rousers. We need some people who are not afraid to say that I am climate conscious, sustainability is my thing, and I'm talking to others like me. And I think that's the big thing about this. It's a lot of other topics are easier to talk about within your own small group of people. So I think that's one of them. But I also think that if you look, there are good speeches. You mentioned one of my 2 Cicero Awards. That was for a speech about sustainability. That was for a speech called Climate Change and the Story of Sarah, in which it was given by a government minister to a group of medical professionals at a conference, and was really about moving the debate from one of this is the science and these are the numbers into being about people, being about health, and being about medical practitioners.
Right.
So there are some good speeches out there, but they're far apart.
Well, I'm sure I'll have to look out yours. But I just wondered whether there was an element of the environment just hasn't, as a kind of a subject, hasn't quite found a way to individualize, to make it appeal to the person rather than to the the wider public, as it were.
Yeah, and that is one of the issues, that in terms of climate communications, not just in speeches but in general, we have an issue that is climate change and to be solved by the consumer as an individual, or is a systemic change that needs to happen? And how do you address or balance that? And that's true. It is a difficult one. It has also it has also been a very polarized debate in many instances where it's been hard to really say what needs to be done and paint this picture of the future and the past as well. So there's some work to be done there, definitely. Yet one of the issues with sustainability is that it has become not just that there are the skeptics, but there have also been this very holy group. I remember being at a protest march, and a guy was giving the microphone and asked, tell us why we need to do this. And this was a great opportunity for him to talk about sustainability and the need for a green transition and what we could all do. He ended up saying that he was a full-time activist, didn't have a job, only doing this, and we should all do that. And I was standing there thinking, I've got a job. I need to bring back food for the table for my kids. I need to pay the rent. These people around me are school children, some of them. They need to go to school as well. Some of them are retired. They're not full-time activists. So there's also a need to find sustainable actions and a sustainable identity behavior in the everyday actions. And that's where it's been hard sometimes to be a green activist, that taking the car is a bad idea. Eating too much meat is a bad idea. I love meat. I love a good lamb chops, but they are immensely bad for the environment. So it's a hard choice to make individual. You really need to address the systemic change, and that becomes a very hard vision to follow. Yeah.
Well, Rune, thank you so much for your views and ideas. I'm sure if there are great environmental speeches, you'll continue to write them and continue to write great speeches, whatever. So it's been fantastic to have your contribution, and thank you so much. And our paths will cross, I'm sure, many times in the future. Thank you very much, Rune.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.